I guess it all started with the silence. It's not like we woke up one day and decided to fall apart. No, it happened gradually, so slowly that it was almost impossible to pinpoint when everything shifted. At first, I thought it was just a phase. We were both busy with our own things, David with his work, and me, well, trying to hold everything together. But eventually, that silence grew louder, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. David's been successful. Way more successful than I ever imagined when we first met. He was a go-getter, always working hard to build his empire, and I admired that about him. But somewhere along the way, his success started to drown out everything else. He stopped coming home on time. He stopped being the man I married. Every night, it was the same. I'd ask if he was coming home for dinner, and he'd just shrug it off, telling me he had another meeting, another late-night call with a client, another deadline. And each time, I would smile, nod, and tell myself that this was just the way things were now. But inside, I was breaking. One night, it hit me harder than usual. It wasn't even that he was late again. It was the message I found on his phone. A quick note to tell me that he wouldn't be home at all because of a meeting with business partners. The words stung, but it wasn't just the words. It was the realization that he hadn't even bothered to call me first. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, and tears started to fall. But they weren't just for that moment. They were for all the nights before it, all the times I begged him to come home, only to be met with a polite but empty excuse. I hated myself for feeling this way, but I couldn't stop it. I was married to a man who no longer saw me, no longer cared, and all I could do was lie there, crying, with the quiet buzzing of his phone in the background, just a constant reminder of how far apart we had drifted. A few days later, when David was, as expected, off again with his business, I found myself feeling more alone than I had in a while. I needed to talk to someone, to be around someone who understood. So, I called John, David's brother. He had always been there for me, always had the right things to say, even if they weren't always what I wanted to hear. We hadn't seen each other in a while, and I guess, for some reason, I needed that connection again. He came over that evening. We didn't plan anything extravagant, just dinner. We cooked together, joked around, and spent hours reminiscing about the good old days, before everything got so complicated. It was nice. But more than that, it was comforting. John listened to me. He didn't try to fix things, or tell me I was overreacting. He just listened. And it felt like a weight lifting off my chest. At some point during dinner, he told me how sorry he was. How sorry he was that David didn't appreciate me the way I deserved. I guess I never realized just how much John had always been aware of what was going on. We'd grown up together. He was always like a brother to me, and there was something about his presence that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in months. Over the next few weeks, we started spending more time together. John would come over for dinner, or we'd meet up at a park for walks. Nothing ever felt out of place. We were just two people catching up on old times. But the more time we spent together, the more I realized how much I missed the kind of connection I had with him. He was emotionally available in a way David hadn't been for a long time. And then, one night, it all changed. David was working late, again. So, John and I were alone. He brought over a bottle of my favorite wine and some old vinyl records we used to listen to when we were younger. We spent hours talking, reminiscing about things that only the two of us shared. It felt nice. It felt like we were reconnecting on a level that I hadn't experienced in a long time. I don't know how it happened. It wasn't planned. But at some point, we were sitting on the couch, and I accidentally brushed his hand. It was the simplest thing, a small gesture. But in that moment, it felt like the world shifted. It wasn't just an accidental touch. It was a spark. And before I could even process it, we kissed. It wasn't passionate. It wasn't anything like the stories you hear. It was just right. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like I mattered to someone. I felt wanted. And that, more than anything, is what changed everything. David started noticing things. At first, it was subtle, little glances, moments where he'd ask what I'd been up to. But then it became more obvious. I could tell by the way he watched me. He noticed how happy I seemed when I came home from spending time with John. He noticed that I was more open, more engaged. At first, I thought it was just a passing phase. I thought I could keep everything in check, keep up the charade. But I was lying to myself. Every time David asked me what I had been doing, I just brushed it off with some half-baked excuse. But he wasn't buying it. And honestly, I wasn't either. The guilt began to creep in, but I couldn't stop myself. I knew what I was doing was wrong, but I also knew that it was the only thing that made me feel alive anymore. The truth was, I was falling for John, and I couldn't help it. One night, after one of these secret rendezvous with John, I met up with Kate, my sister. She's always been the one person I could turn to for advice, even if she had a way of making me see things I didn't want to see. We were at a party when she asked me about David. She could tell something was off, and she wasn't going to let me hide it. "Are you okay?" she asked, her eyes narrowing in concern. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. What was I supposed to say? That everything was falling apart? That I was slowly drowning in my own choices? I told her the truth, though. Maybe not the whole truth, but enough of it. "I feel lost," I admitted quietly. "Like David isn't the man I married anymore. I don't know how to fix it." Kate didn't judge me. She didn't lecture me. But she did warn me. She told me that if I wasn't careful, everything I had could be destroyed. And the worst part was, I knew she was right, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't stop myself from falling deeper into this mess. This is how it all started. The decline, the betrayal, the unraveling of everything I thought I knew about love and marriage. And even though I knew where this was heading, I couldn't bring myself to stop. Not yet. Not until it was too late. The cracks in my relationship with David were already too deep to ignore, and I was already too far gone. David came home early that day. It wasn't something I expected, and I had no idea how to handle it. I was sitting with John, talking and laughing, trying to forget about the mess that had taken over my life. John had always been there, always made me feel like I was important. But when David walked in, all of that vanished. I saw the look in his eyes, and in that moment, I knew he knew. He didn't say anything. He didn't yell, didn't accuse. He just stood there, frozen, staring at us. The silence felt suffocating, and I felt a sharp pain in my chest. I knew I had been careless, but I hadn't expected him to find out like this, not with so little warning. David turned around and walked out without a word. I could tell he was trying to keep his cool, but I knew the storm was coming. The night felt different after that. The air felt thick with tension. I could hardly look at John, who was just as uncomfortable as I was. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and I didn't know if I was about to fall, or if I'd somehow find a way to pull myself back from the edge. Later that night, David didn't come home. I couldn't sleep, couldn't even try. My mind raced, trying to figure out what would happen next. I knew that this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. David wasn't the type to just accept what happened. And as much as I hated myself for getting involved with John, I knew David wasn't going to take it lying down. The next few days were filled with tension. David came home late, barely speaking. He was distant, colder than usual. But I knew something was different. He was planning something. He wasn't going to let this go. And then, he made his move. He started spending more time with Sarah, his business partner. She had always been around, but I never thought much of it. They had meetings, discussions, casual work-related conversations. But now, something had changed. I could see the way he looked at her. The way he smiled when she walked into a room. It wasn't just business anymore. David was angry, and I knew he was getting his revenge in the only way he knew how. Slowly but surely, the lines between their business relationship blurred. He'd come home late, and I knew where he had been. It wasn't just the late nights. It was the little things, the subtle changes in his behavior. I wasn't stupid. I knew what was happening. But at that point, I couldn't even bring myself to care. It wasn't long before it turned into more than just a flirtation. Sarah knew exactly what she was doing. She saw David as an opportunity, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. She had always been the ambitious type, and now, with David emotionally broken and vulnerable, she was right there, ready to pick up the pieces. And David, he wasn't putting up any resistance. Eventually, it happened. One night, David came home late, his face hard and unreadable. He said nothing about the day, nothing about the affair that had been growing between him and Sarah. I knew what had happened. I knew because his eyes told me everything I needed to know. The emptiness, the anger, the satisfaction. He had finally crossed the line. And that was when I realized the truth. We were both destroying each other. We were both making each other pay for the pain we had caused. But instead of feeling justified, I only felt more lost. He had turned to Sarah to fill the void, to reclaim some sense of power, and yet, nothing about it made him feel any better. He came home to me that night, distant, like a stranger. But while David was sinking into his own revenge, I was starting to rebuild myself. The betrayal with John had torn me apart, but now, I had nothing left to lose. I didn't know what I wanted or where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay in this marriage anymore. That's when I met Lucas. He was someone new, someone who hadn't been a part of all this mess. He wasn't a solution, but he became my emotional anchor. Lucas didn't judge me. He didn't push me to make any decisions. He simply listened. He was patient, kind, and his presence made me feel seen again. We spent time together, talking about everything and nothing. I hadn't felt this peaceful in months. Lucas helped me process everything that had happened, and slowly, I started to feel like I could breathe again. The pain wasn't gone, but it didn't consume me anymore. I began to regain my confidence. I didn't need to depend on David, on John, on anyone. I was finding my own strength. But as I started to heal, David was in his own spiral. He had found Sarah, and as much as it hurt to admit it, I knew he had found someone to help him forget. Just like I had turned to John, David was now turning to Sarah. But there was something different about it. His anger and pain seemed to fuel the affair. He wasn't just looking for comfort. He was trying to prove something. He was trying to show me that he could move on, too. I think we both knew that we were too far gone to fix things. But still, we held on. Neither of us knew how to let go. It wasn't until I ran into John again that I realized how much everything had changed. I saw him at the grocery store, and for a moment, I wanted to run. I wasn't ready for this conversation. But John, being John, approached me. "Emily," he said quietly, "we need to talk." I didn't want to hear it, but I couldn't avoid it. We found a bench and sat down. The tension was thick, and we both knew what had to be said. "I'm sorry," John said. "I never meant for things to get this out of hand." I nodded. I wasn't sure if I could forgive him, but I didn't have it in me to argue. The anger wasn't there anymore. There was just exhaustion and sadness. We had both made choices that led us here. And now, nothing would ever be the same again. David knew about the affair with John by now. He had confronted him, and the fallout was as messy as I expected. The anger, the accusations. It was everything I had been dreading. But it wasn't about who was right or wrong anymore. It was about the fact that we had both gone down this path, and there was no turning back. As much as I wanted to believe that this could be fixed, I knew deep down that it couldn't. Our marriage had already died long before we started playing these games. But the truth was, revenge was hollow. It never gave us the satisfaction we thought it would. It only made everything worse. And so, as we both stumbled through our own broken lives, I began to realize that the only thing left for us was to let go. Let go of the past. Let go of the anger. Let go of each other. I knew it was over. There was no pretending anymore. My marriage was completely broken, and I was just too tired to keep holding on. David was lost in his own world, consumed by the business, by his anger, and by the affair he was having. I couldn't fix him, and honestly, I couldn't fix us either. My mind wandered endlessly, replaying every mistake, every broken promise. I had once thought we had something strong, something unbreakable, but that was just a lie. It was all just a facade. I started to question everything, my life, my choices, everything I thought I knew about love and happiness. How had I gotten here? How had we gotten here? I remembered the good times, the times when we were happy, when David and I could talk about our dreams, about what we wanted for the future. But somewhere along the way, that disappeared. We lost touch with each other. We became strangers living in the same house, passing each other in the hallway, but never really seeing one another. John and I had tried to hold on to something that felt right in the beginning, but it was crumbling. Every time we spent time together, guilt weighed on me. It wasn't just the guilt of betraying my husband anymore. It was the guilt of what John and I were becoming, an escape. We were using each other to fill the void left by our broken relationships, But deep down, I knew it wasn't real. It couldn't be. And each time I saw John, I felt more lost. Was I really in love with him? Or was he just the distraction I needed to keep from facing the truth? One afternoon, as I was sitting alone in the kitchen, contemplating everything, I got a text. It was from Monica. Monica, David's ex-girlfriend. I hadn't heard from her in years, and honestly, I hadn't expected to. But apparently, she had decided that now was the perfect time to reappear. I didn't know what she wanted, but I had a sinking feeling it wasn't just to catch up. The message was casual at first, asking how I was, commenting on how much things had changed in the neighborhood. But then, she dropped the bomb. She wanted to meet up with David. Apparently, she was in town for a business conference, and she thought it might be helpful to stop by his office to offer some assistance with a project. The excuse was weak, but I knew her intentions. I could feel it in my bones. Monica had always had this way about her, this aura of confidence that made men, especially David, fall for her. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. I couldn't ignore the thought of her inserting herself back into his life, trying to pick up where they left off. They had been good together once, and part of me feared that she might still have some hold over him. The next day, I found out that Monica had made her move. I walked into the living room and found David sitting with her, his face tight with annoyance. They were discussing business, but I could tell something was off. Monica was leaning in too much, laughing too loudly at things that weren't funny, touching his arm in a way that was far too intimate. I left the room without saying a word, but inside, something broke. The jealousy was almost suffocating, but it wasn't just about her. It was about everything. I wasn't sure if I was more afraid of losing David to Monica or losing myself in all of this chaos. Either way, it was clear that there was no going back. And just when I thought things couldn't get worse, George, the nosy neighbor, decided to insert himself into our already messed up lives. He had always been the type to stick his nose into everyone's business. He thought he was being helpful, but it always came across as invasive. I never liked him much, but now, with everything else going wrong, his constant interruptions were the last thing I needed. It started with little things. He'd stop by to check on us, asking how David was doing, how the business was going. At first, it seemed harmless, but George had a way of digging too deep. He'd ask about David's late nights, about my well-being, about our relationship in a way that felt uncomfortable. I could tell he was making his own assumptions, spreading his own gossip, and I hated it. One evening, he even knocked on the door, looking for David, but instead, he launched into a rant about how he had noticed David's behavior was off, and how it was affecting everyone around us. He seemed to think I was somehow to blame for David's problems, insinuating that I should be doing more to support him, to fix things. His opinions made me feel small, like I was the one responsible for everything falling apart. I tried to brush him off, but it wasn't easy. George wasn't going to stop, and every time I saw him, it was like a reminder that I had no privacy, no control over my life anymore. It felt like everyone was watching, everyone was judging. Meanwhile, David's business was slipping further into chaos. His focus was completely gone, consumed by his emotional turmoil. He was distracted, unfocused, and his partners were starting to notice. I could hear him arguing with them late at night, trying to keep things afloat, but it was clear that his world was unraveling. David wasn't the same man anymore. His anger and resentment had consumed him, and I knew it was only a matter of time before everything collapsed. I could see it in his eyes, the exhaustion, the frustration, the sense of defeat. The business that had once been his pride was now a weight he could no longer carry. And as much as he tried to maintain control, I knew it was slipping through his fingers. I felt so alone in all of this. It seemed like the more I tried to fix things, the worse it got. My relationship with John was crumbling under the weight of guilt and confusion. I couldn't even look at him without wondering if we had just been fooling ourselves. Had we ever really been in love? Or had we just been two broken people trying to escape our own realities? I was lost, and I had no idea how to find my way out. The walls were closing in on me, and the more I tried to escape, the more trapped I became. My marriage was over. My relationship with John was a mess, and I was left with nothing but regret and confusion. As the days passed, I realized that I couldn't keep running. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Something had to give, but I didn't know what it was or how to make it happen. All I knew was that I was drowning in a life that had become a constant reminder of everything I had lost. And with Monica reappearing, with George sticking his nose in our business, I wasn't sure how much more I could take before I completely broke. The day the divorce papers arrived, everything became official. The weight of it hit me like a ton of bricks. For months, I had been living in a fog, trying to make sense of my shattered life. But now it was real. It was happening. David and I were officially ending what we had built together. The dreams we once shared, the plans for the future, it was all gone, reduced to nothing more than a series of legal documents and financial negotiations. David fought hard. He used his business acumen to navigate the legal process, making sure that he walked away with as much as possible. He fought for the house, the investments, the assets. He wasn't just taking what he felt was fair. He was trying to win. And in his mind, winning meant leaving me with as little as possible. I don't think it was just about money for him, though. It was about control. He had lost everything else, and this was the one thing he could still grasp. I didn't fight back in the same way. I couldn't. My heart wasn't in it anymore. All I wanted was to be free of the endless drama, free of the accusations, the lies, the betrayal. But I couldn't avoid the consequences. I wasn't just losing my marriage. I was losing my identity. Who was I without David? Who was I without the life we had built together? There were nights when I couldn't sleep, when the reality of what was happening overwhelmed me. I found myself pacing, lost in thought, wondering where everything had gone wrong. But even in the midst of all the pain, I knew one thing. This was the end. There was no going back. David's life, on the other hand, seemed to be moving in the opposite direction. As his emotional life fell apart, his business was on the rise. He'd started working closely with Liam, a new investor who had his sights set on expanding the company. Liam was ambitious, driven, and willing to invest in David's vision. Slowly but surely, the business began to recover. It was almost as if David's personal collapse had sparked something in him professionally. He threw himself into work, hoping it would fill the void left by everything he had lost. But even as his company started thriving again, there was something missing. He had the wealth, the power, the success, but none of it could replace what had been lost. I heard bits and pieces about Liam, how he had been instrumental in turning things around. He'd advised David to focus on his personal well-being, to heal emotionally. But David didn't listen. He didn't care. He didn't need to. He thought success was the answer, that it would fix everything. But deep down, I knew he was still empty. No amount of money or business success could bring back the love we had lost. As for me, I was left to pick up the pieces of my broken life. The divorce, the betrayal, the emotional turmoil, it had all taken its toll. But in the midst of all the chaos, I knew I couldn't just stay stuck. I needed help. I needed to find a way to heal. That's when I started seeing Rachel, a therapist who helped me navigate the mess of my emotions. At first, it felt uncomfortable. Talking about everything, the betrayal, the pain, the guilt, it felt raw. But slowly, Rachel helped me unpack the trauma. She guided me through the wreckage of my marriage and showed me the patterns that had led me to where I was. Through therapy, I started to understand why I had allowed myself to be so lost in John, why I had let his presence become a temporary escape from the misery of my marriage. I also began to understand David better. He wasn't just emotionally distant because of his work. There were deeper issues, things he had never addressed, things I could never fix for him. And in that understanding, I began to forgive myself. Rachel helped me start rebuilding who I was. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I felt like I was back at square one, but slowly, I began to reclaim my sense of self. I started focusing on things that made me feel whole again. I worked on building a new life, one that didn't revolve around David or John, one where I could exist for myself, not for anyone else. And yet, even as I began to find some peace, Monica kept showing up in David's life. She didn't give up. She was relentless in her pursuit, appearing at business events, sending him messages, and even trying to engage with him outside of work. At first, David didn't give her much attention. He was emotionally unavailable, lost in his own world. But Monica was persistent, and every time I heard about her attempts, it felt like another reminder of everything I had lost. She wanted him back, and no matter how many times he rejected her, she didn't seem ready to give up. I could see it now. David was no longer interested in her. But it didn't matter. She wasn't there for him. She was there to fill the space he left behind. She was a distraction, a way for him to pretend he could move on from everything that had happened. But it wasn't real. Nothing about it was real. George, the nosy neighbor, didn't help. His interference became more than just an inconvenience. It became a constant source of stress. He had always been the type to ask too many questions, to stick his nose into other people's business, but now, it felt like he was actively trying to manage my life for me. Every time I ran into him, he had something to say. "Are you moving on yet?" he'd ask, as though it were his right to know. "You should be dating by now. Don't waste your time grieving." His judgment felt suffocating. The last thing I needed was his unsolicited advice, especially when I was still trying to pick up the pieces of my shattered existence. It was one thing for him to ask about David's behavior, but for him to tell me how to live my life, it crossed a line. One evening, after one too many encounters with George, I had enough. I stood my ground for the first time in months. I told him that I didn't need his advice, that I wasn't ready to move on yet, and that I didn't owe him an explanation. For the first time in ages, I set a boundary. It was simple, but it felt like a small victory. That moment of self-assertion was a turning point for me. It was a sign that I was finally starting to take control of my life again. The divorce had left me broken, but I was beginning to rebuild. Slowly, piece by piece, I was putting myself back together. It was a long road, and I wasn't sure where it would lead, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could finally breathe again. The finalization of the divorce was a turning point, not just in our legal lives, but in our emotional worlds. David and I sat across from each other for the last time as a couple, facing the end of something that had once meant everything. The years we had spent together, the highs and lows, the dreams we had shared, they were now just memories, reduced to paperwork and signatures. There was no anger left in me, no bitterness. I had spent so much time in therapy, reflecting on the past, understanding my own wounds, and I had finally reached a place where I no longer needed David's approval or apology. The woman I once was, the one who needed him to validate my worth, was gone. I had moved beyond the anger, beyond the need for any explanation or justification. David, on the other hand, was still struggling. His business had flourished, but his personal life remained a mess of unresolved emotions. He couldn't seem to escape the feeling of failure, despite the wealth he had accumulated. In the quiet moments, I could see the weariness in his eyes. He apologized, and while it wasn't the first time, this time it felt different. He wasn't apologizing to win me back. He was apologizing because he knew he had lost something important, something he couldn't recover. I told him, simply, that I had found peace without him. I had learned to let go, and in that moment, I felt something in me shift, complete closure. We were done, and both of us could now move on. David started meeting Isabel not long after our divorce was finalized. Isabel was different from the women he had known before. She didn't try to fix him or smooth over his flaws. She saw through his tough exterior and gave him the space to be who he was, but without enabling his self-destructive tendencies. Isabel was kind, intelligent, and compassionate, and for the first time in a long while, David didn't feel the pressure to be perfect. Their relationship grew steadily, and for the first time since his marriage to me, David began to experience what it felt like to be truly seen. Not as a business success, but as a man capable of vulnerability. He still carried scars, but he started to believe in the possibility of healing. Isabel gave him the room to heal, and slowly, he began to rebuild not just his business empire but his sense of self-worth. As for me, I had met Ryan at a networking event shortly after my divorce. He was different from David in every way. Ryan was supportive and patient, someone who actually listened to me when I spoke and saw me as an equal. He didn't expect me to be anything other than myself. Where David had been distant, Ryan was present. Where David had been emotionally unavailable, Ryan was attentive. Our relationship wasn't rushed, and that made all the difference. Ryan gave me the space to grow, to rediscover what it meant to be loved for who I was, not for who I could be in a marriage. Slowly, but surely, I began to feel secure in myself again. For the first time in years, I felt like I was enough just as I was, and Ryan's love only reinforced that. David continued to see success in his business, thanks to his partnership with Liam. While his professional life soared, there was still an undercurrent of emptiness in him. Success wasn't enough to fill the hole inside him. He still carried the weight of his past mistakes, but he had learned to embrace the idea of balance. Work was important, but it couldn't be everything. Isabel helped him realize that it was possible to be successful while also nurturing the parts of himself that needed healing. David had finally come to terms with his failures and began to accept that growth was a long-term process, not a quick fix. Though his past haunted him, he was learning to move forward with purpose, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. Meanwhile, my transformation continued. The woman who had once craved validation, who had allowed her marriage to define her worth, had found a new strength. My career flourished, but more importantly, I had developed deep, meaningful friendships built on honesty and mutual support. The pain of the past was still with me, but it no longer controlled me. I had learned to trust myself again, to know my own worth without needing anyone else to tell me. I had rebuilt myself from the ground up, and the woman I had become was someone I could be proud of. And then, one day, I saw David again at a mutual friends gathering. It was awkward, of course. How could it not be? We hadn't seen each other in months, and there was still the weight of everything that had happened between us. But this time, there was no bitterness, no resentment. We didn't need to hash out the details of our divorce or our mistakes. We simply acknowledged each other's growth, the paths we had each taken since parting ways. It was respectful, even kind, and though the past was always there, it no longer defined who we were. We had both moved on, in our own ways, and in that moment, I realized that we had finally let go. Our relationship had once been filled with love, betrayal, pain, and hope. But now, it had evolved into something unexpected, a chapter in both our lives that, while painful, had ultimately led us to where we needed to be. We parted ways with a simple, sincere nod. There was no need for anything more. Our relationship had ended, but it was no longer a wound. It was a part of our past, and it was time for both of us to embrace the future. David and I had come full circle. We were no longer the people we once were, and we didn't need each other to be whole anymore. The journey we had shared, with all its pain and mistakes, had taught us both invaluable lessons. And as we both stood at the threshold of new beginnings, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. We had survived, and we were moving on. And for the first time, we were both free.